Christopher Steele, welcome to the program. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Tom. Pleased to be here with you.
So, tell me, first of all, the question I'm sure you inevitably always get asked right off the bat, and that people are wondering is, what's the latest on the PP tapes?
I think there are a couple of points that I'd make on that subject. One is, of course, that this is established Russian modus operandi. This is how Russian security services work, and there have been numerous examples in the past involving people like the Prosecutor General in the 1990s and the former Prime Minister and so on. And people don't immediately realize that.
By this, you're talking about Trump being handed basically a couple of hookers.
The Russian intelligence services wire up most of the hotels in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and they record what goes on in them. And we've seen that happen numerous times, including to foreign visitors, but also to their own public figures. So this is not a big surprise in a way to us. It may be shocking, but it's not surprising. The second thing to say, of course, is that, as I draw out in the book, a couple of other sort of information points on this issue. One is the exchange between Michael Cohen and a Georgian Russian contact of his in Moscow that features in the Mueller report and hasn't been highlighted, which was a discussion between them in 2016 about sex tapes and Donald Trump. So that's, I think, quite significant. And then over and above that, obviously, other things that have come to light more recently in terms of this particular issue.
So you're of the opinion that the probability or possibility of the existence of these tapes is still a legitimate concern?
I think it's a legitimate concern, and sadly, I don't think we will ever know the full truth of this until and unless the Putin regime falls and we get access to the security service files, a bit like we did with the famous Stasi files, if you remember, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the East German state. So I really hope one day that we will see those files, and I think that it's quite possible and conceivable that the Putin regime will collapse at some point, but it's not doing so at the moment.
Yeah, I used to live in West Germany, right on the East German border. So I have often thought about going back and seeing if I'm in the Stasi files. I did visit East Germany a couple of times. Anyhow,
just on that point, actually interesting. My business partner Chris Burrows, who served in East Berlin in the Foreign Office, he actually managed to get hold of his Stasi file from that era, and it was 300 pages long. Wow. And he's actually writing a book about that. So who knows what we might find in the future if the regime in Moscow does in fact fall.
Well, pardon the digression. We're talking with Christopher Steele. He's got a new book out, Unredacted, which is just absolutely brilliant. You've got to get it. How would I go about getting my Stasi files?
I think you can actually apply for them officially to the German government. That's how Chris got his. But you may have to actually go to Germany to do that. But it would certainly be, if you're interested, I'm sure you could get hold of them if they're still there.
Yeah, well, I do go there with some regularity, and I speak German, so yeah, fascinating. Thank you. You note in your book that, or you share some new information about Donald Trump's ties to Russia, or point out that there is new information about his ties to Russia. Tell us about that.
Well, there are two different things here. Obviously, Russian interference, as it's carried on after 2016, is one thing. And then there's some other information which is new about his ties to Russia. I'm not sure it's new. It certainly hasn't been picked up. It hasn't been sort of fed into the public debate. I mean, this issue of whether he ever met Russian officials when he went there, for example, and there's a photograph of him with a local fixer called David Giovannis meeting the deputy mayor of Moscow, I think back in the 1990s or the early noughties, as we call them. So I think there are points of detail there are information points. And we've seen from other reporting of late, and particularly this Bob Woodward book, which I haven't read yet, but which I understand sort of puts forward at least some source evidence that Trump and Putin have had some numerous phone calls since Trump left office. So there's some strange things going on in that space, certainly.
Given what you know about Trump's associations with Putin and Moscow's interest in American politics, what would be your speculation about if he has had, per Bob Woodward, at least 7 conversations with Putin since he left office, about the nature of those conversations? Do you think that they would be commercial, like, hey, I still want to build a Trump Tower, or that they would be political, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think my main concern would be, and a lot of this does revolve around Ukraine, of course, and it always has done, that attempts in Congress or by Trump to get congressional Republicans to block aid and assistance, particularly military aid to Ukraine, earlier this year, and indeed probably previously, would have featured in those conversations. I don't know, obviously, but that would be the main concern.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably quite likely, because Putin is effectively obsessed with Ukraine. Putin sees defeating Ukraine, subjugating Ukraine, reincorporating Ukraine or parts of it, what have you, as essential to his legacy, effectively. And he's been prepared to sacrifice a very large number of his own citizens and youth particularly in what is a quagmire of a battle which he hasn't prevailed in. So I think that a lot of the roads in all these issues, whether it's Trump or Russian interference or the war, lead back to Ukraine.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. The Mueller report, you read about the failures of the Mueller report, and Trump is running around going, Russia, 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 hoax, hoax, hoax. Speak to that, please.
Yeah, I think the Mueller report was a criminal investigation, effectively. I mean, that was his brief. It wasn't a counterintelligence investigation. There's a significant difference between counterintelligence and what you can do with it and criminal evidence. The main issue with counterintelligence is to understand how your adversary operates and to try and disrupt it effectively. Very rarely does counterintelligence information get into a court proceeding, not least because sources obviously have to be protected, methods have to be protected. So I think the Mueller investigation was necessarily rather limited. And what surprised me, I think, were 2 things. One was that he didn't really follow the money, as it were, as I know is a phrase that relates to Watergate in your country. And it didn't seem to be any attempt to look into Trump's history of his economic and financial ties with Russia. I think one of his sons once mentioned that a lot of their money came from Russian investors.
Both of his sons have said that on different occasions. Christopher Steele, tell us about ongoing Russian activities directed against the United States and other Western democracies.
Yes, I think it's important to note that since Russia invaded Ukraine on a full-scale basis in 2022, there's evidence that Russia not only has been interfering and intervening in Western elections, but also is conducting a very sinister program of sabotage, what we call kinetic operations, physical operations, assassinations, sabotage, and other things, not just in countries like Eastern Europe, but also in Britain. We have just this week been told by our security service that not only is Russia trying to stir up unrest on our streets, but also there was a incendiary device discovered in a warehouse that had been flown into Britain on an aircraft, and it went off in this warehouse soon after it had landed. So I think there is really quite worrying signs that the gloves are off and that the old rules of the game no longer apply. In terms of specific election interference, we had a claim in July when we had the election here, that Russia was interfering on behalf of Reform UK, which is the hard-right nationalist party of Nigel Farage, who you may have heard of. And that had come from our Deputy Prime Minister at the time, Oliver Dowden. In terms of the US scene, obviously you've had several interesting developments. You had I think, Tenet Media indictments or related indictments a few months ago, a month ago maybe. And then what our own intelligence and what our own sources are telling us is that the Russians have been looking at the US election since the beginning of the year and what they could do to put sort of finger on the dial to help Trump and to help Republicans, who they see as isolationist, as they see as not reliable allies of Ukraine, which has been proven by that vote in Congress earlier in the year, where more than half the Republicans in the House of Representatives voted against further aid to Ukraine. And they're looking at things like inflation. They're looking at the weak points as they see it in terms of the Biden administration's record, the border. Mexico City has now become one of the main hubs of Russian intelligence activity, which it never used to be to the same extent. There are suggestions from sources that the Russians are looking at stirring up trouble on the southern border, maybe using organised crime and other things which make them their operations plausibly deniable, as they call it, and also to keep inflation high in the economy by keeping the oil price high. And certainly Putin has put a lot of effort in recent years into cultivating the leaders of OPEC countries, which Russia wasn't traditionally close to and is not actually in OPEC, but which are essential in terms of limiting supply and keeping the price high, which also not only does it inflict inflation into our economies, it also increases Russia's profits from oil, which are used fundamentally to fund the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, so that's a real challenge, it seems. I noticed when they cut production last year, I thought, okay, here it comes, and it looks like President Biden has outsmarted them. Mr. Steele, the Trump victory, you write, a Trump victory in 2024 would be catastrophic. Can you lay out for us what you would expect to happen based on the knowledge that you have of Trump and also of Trump's alliances? I mean, would he, for example, would he pull the United States out of NATO and seek to form an alliance with Russia, China, North Korea, that sort of? I mean, could it get that extreme?
I'm not sure it would go quite that far, certainly not initially. But I think the issue in NATO and in our alliance is whether we have this Article 5 confirmed, that we have mutual self-defense against the likes of Russia and China. And I think there's a significant worry, particularly actually in Eastern Europe, in places like the Baltic states and Poland, that Trump will not be reliable in that regard, and that effectively collective defence in NATO will disappear. And if you remember, actually, it's quite significant that the only time Article 5 has ever been invoked was by the United States itself after 9/11, at which time all of us NATO allies of yours came to your assistance. So I think that's a very significant risk going forward. I also think that an isolationist America, if we look at history, and the Republican Party is now becoming very isolationist, Trump is very isolationist and not in favour of free trade, means that the international order, of which America is the anchor really, will come under threat. And I suspect that aid will be cut off to Ukraine, that Russia may in fact then prevail in Ukraine in some shape or form, which would set a terrible example to China over Taiwan, which I don't think Trump is committed to defending, and indeed other despotic regimes and authoritarian regimes which have their eye on territories owned by and sovereign to other states.
Do you
things
see
like Venezuela and Guyana even? I mean, it is there are many territorial disputes in the world that could boil over if Russia is allowed to prevail in Ukraine by a second Trump presidency.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you see a growing bifurcation of the world, basically a new allies versus axis? And if so, what kind of danger does that present? Where might it go?
It presents a danger of proliferation of technologies and weapons and political instability. I think I say in the book that I'm not convinced of the alliance between China and Russia. At the moment, China has far too much stake in the world international order, particularly the economic order of free trade and free passage, to go down that route. But I certainly think that it's possible that China could become like Russia if it's mishandled. And I think that's a big threat going forward. And the ultimate sort of barometer of that, of course, would be if China were to make a move towards Taiwan, or either blockading Taiwan, which is probably more likely than an invasion, but still a very serious development, which would result in sanctions and our economy going down. Because I think whilst we can deal probably with a rogue Russia, I'm not sure we can deal with a rogue China, and certainly the world economy can't. So I think there are lots of elements there which are deeply worrying, where a lot of the stability and the wealth creation and the harmony that we've had over the last 80 years in the West would be significantly impacted.
We have a little less than a minute to a hard break here. I'm curious if you see any wild cards in this equation. I know China is reaching out to Africa aggressively. Russia's trying to consolidate relationships around the world, now with Cuba, I guess, more aggressively.
I don't see any wild cards, but what I do see very disappointingly is that the battle for the hearts and minds, if you like, of the global south, particularly those countries in the global south which are large and at least semi-democratic like Brazil and India, do not seem to be on side any longer. And one of the reasons for that is that China is trading with them more and lending them more money. There's an amazing diagram I saw which compared China and America as main trading partners in the world of different countries, and in 2000 America was by far the biggest trading partner of most countries, and now it's China, and that's a very fundamental shift that is gradual but radical, and which portends a difficulty of us in terms of the global south.